Ohio, 1995. A quiet spring evening shattered when 35-year-old elementary school teacher Laura Whitmore vanished without a trace. Her car was found idling near a rural road outside Dayton. Driver's door open, purse still inside. For weeks, her community clung to hope, until that hope faded into heartbreak. Police chased rumors, false confessions, and dead ends. Years turned into decades, files gathered dust. But then, in 2025, a new generation of detectives reopened the forgotten evidence box, and a single drop of DNA began to whisper the truth. This is the story of a teacher, a town's grief, and a decades-long pursuit of justice finally fulfilled. Before we begin, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. In the spring of 1995, Dayton, Ohio was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked and waved at passing cars. Nestled among quiet neighborhoods and sprawling parks, it was a community that thrived on routine. And few people embodied that small-town rhythm more than Laura Whitmore, a 35-year-old elementary school teacher whose gentle presence left an imprint on everyone she met. Laura taught second grade at Maplewood Elementary, a brick school surrounded by oak trees and a playground she'd helped repaint the summer before. Parents trusted her completely. She had a way of making even the shyest children feel seen. Her students adored her soft-spoken encouragements, her habit of leaving handwritten notes in their desks. "You're braver than you think." At home, Laura lived alone in a small blue house at the end of Elmhurst Drive. She'd bought it after saving for nearly a decade, proud to have a place that was entirely her own. Her evenings were simple, grading papers at the kitchen table, watering her potted plants, or reading by the window as the sun set over the quiet street. Neighbors often saw her jogging in the morning or chatting with the mailman. She seemed content, peaceful, and entirely ordinary. But to those closest to her, Laura's calm exterior masked a life that wasn't as uneventful as it seemed. Her parents, Jim and Ellen Whitmore, lived only a few miles away, and Laura visited them every Sunday after church. They often told friends how lucky they were to have such a thoughtful daughter, one who never forgot to call, who still brought homemade casseroles when her mother was ill. She was their pride, their light. Her friends described her as cautious but not fearful, the type of woman who double-checked her locks but laughed at her own overthinking. Yet in the months leading up to her disappearance, subtle hints of unease began to creep into her otherwise predictable days. There was the phone call she mentioned to a coworker, someone breathing on the line, saying nothing. She'd brushed it off as a prank, but it lingered in her mind. Then there was the car, a faded red sedan that neighbors occasionally noticed parked across from her house late at night. Once she even stepped outside to confront it, but it sped off before she could get close enough to see the driver. Still, nothing about Laura suggested fear. She continued her routines, attended church, and planned a summer literacy program for struggling kids. To her friends, she seemed tired lately. Maybe from overwork, but otherwise the same dependable. Laura, who brought cookies to staff meetings and donated to every classroom fundraiser. The last known photo of her, before everything changed, was taken at a school charity event. A candid shot of Laura laughing, hair pulled back, sunlight in her eyes. It would later become the image printed on flyers and news broadcasts across Ohio. Looking back, detectives would note how eerily normal those final months appeared. There were no clear threats, no dramatic warnings. Just a few odd moments, too small at the time to seem dangerous. In interviews years later, her parents would say they often wondered if Laura sensed something was wrong. Did she ever feel watched on those quiet drives home from school? Did she notice someone following her as she stopped at the grocery store or picked up takeout on Friday nights? For now, though, in early 1995, Dayton still saw her as one of their best, kind, trustworthy, the sort of person you couldn't imagine anyone wanting to hurt. The truth, of course, would prove otherwise, because beneath the calm of her quiet neighborhood, something dark had already begun to stir, something that would soon shatter the peace of Elmhurst Drive and change Dayton forever. What was the first sign that Laura's safe world was beginning to crack? Sunday, May 14, 1995, began like any other spring evening in Dayton. The weather was calm, the streets quiet, and Laura Whitmore was smiling in a photo taken at her friend's baby shower earlier that night, holding a plate of cake, surrounded by laughter. Friends remembered her as relaxed, happy, and talking about the end of the school year. She left the gathering around 8:30 p.m., promising to call the next morning. At 8:47 p.m., Laura phoned her parents from the road. She told her mother she'd had a lovely time and would visit them for dinner the following evening. The call was short, ordinary, but it would be the last time anyone heard her voice. When Laura didn't show up for school on Monday morning, her absence immediately raised alarm. She was never late, never missed a day without notice. A colleague called her house, no answer. Then another teacher drove by her home, her car wasn't there. Within hours, concern spread from the school to her family. By noon, her parents had filed a missing person report. That afternoon, police began tracing her route home. A patrol car found Laura's green Honda Accord parked near an old railroad bridge just outside Dayton. The scene was haunting. The car door hung open, engine still faintly warm, keys lying on the seat. Her purse sat untouched on the passenger side, wallet and phone inside. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no footprints, no tire marks leading away. It looked as though she had simply stepped out and vanished. Detectives cordoned off the area and began their search. The surrounding fields were damp from recent rain, leading down to the dark curve of the Stillwater River. Officers swept the banks, calling her name through the twilight. Volunteers joined in, friends, parents, students' families forming human chains through the tall grass. Helicopters flew overhead with searchlights cutting across the trees, but as night fell, the silence deepened. Every passing hour seemed heavier than the last. By the second day, vigils were held at Maplewood Elementary. Children placed flowers and drawings by her classroom door, too young to understand the magnitude of what had happened. Rumors began spreading quickly, first whispered, then broadcast on local news. Some said Laura had been stalked. Others speculated about a jealous ex or a random stranger who'd followed her home from the baby shower. Police investigated each lead, interviewing guests from the party, her co-workers, even former students' parents. But no one recalled anything suspicious that night. No strange cars following her, no arguments, no raised voices. The local media seized on the mystery. A beloved teacher, a quiet town, a car left abandoned near a river. It was the kind of story that gripped an entire community. Flyers appeared on telephone poles. Volunteers from surrounding counties joined the search. But the woods yielded nothing. No footprints, no clothing, no sign of a struggle. It was as if Laura had been swallowed by the darkness itself. Detective Harold McKinney, one of the first on the scene, would later say that the quiet around that bridge haunted him. You could hear the river moving, but nothing else, he recalled. It was like the world had gone still, like something terrible had already happened and the land was keeping it secret. By the end of that week, fear began replacing hope. Dayton was no longer the small, safe town it once believed itself to be. Parents started locking doors that had always been open. Teachers left work in groups instead of walking to their cars alone. And as police struggled to piece together Laura's final moments, one chilling question hung in the air, unanswered, unbearable, and growing louder with each passing day. Was Laura taken by someone she knew, or a stranger waiting in the dark? 2 weeks after Laura Whitmore vanished, Dayton's collective hope began to wane. The search parties were thinning out, the vigils quieter, and even the press had begun shifting focus to newer stories. But on the gray morning of May 29, 1995, everything changed. At around 6:15 a.m., a fisherman casting his line along the Stillwater River, just north of town, noticed something pale caught in the tangled roots of a fallen tree near the riverbank. At first, he thought it was debris, maybe a mannequin washed downstream. But when he drew closer, the truth hit him with gut-wrenching force. It was a woman. He called the sheriff's office with shaking hands. Within the hour, the banks of the Stillwater were crawling with investigators, their boots sinking into the mud as they taped off the scene. Local news crews arrived soon after, cameras rolling as officers carefully removed the body. The entire town seemed to hold its breath, waiting for confirmation of what everyone already feared. By afternoon, dental records confirmed the impossible. The body belonged to Laura K. Whitmore. News spread fast. Schools closed early. Maplewood Elementary canceled classes for the week. Students and teachers wept in hallways. Parents gathered at the church on 5th Street to pray, their candles flickering beneath framed photos of Laura smiling with her students. For the Whitmore family, the confirmation shattered the fragile hope they'd clung to. Their daughter, the woman who had spent her life nurturing others, was gone. The case was no longer a disappearance. It was a homicide. The autopsy offered only fragments of a story. Laura had suffered head trauma and signs of a struggle. There were abrasions on her wrists, possibly from restraint. Toxicology came back clean. No drugs, no alcohol. But the cause of death was ruled asphyxiation, likely by force. Investigators found traces of foreign fibers on her clothing and an unidentified fingerprint smudged on the inside of her car door. Beneath her fingernails, a tiny amount of biological material was recovered, what today would be a crucial piece of DNA evidence. But in 1995, forensic science couldn't yet identify or sequence it. It was logged, sealed, and filed away, its importance unrealized. Detectives pieced together the few known details. Laura had left the baby shower alone. Her car was found only a few miles from the Stillwater, suggesting she'd either been lured from her vehicle or forced off the road. The riverbank showed disturbed soil, as if someone had slipped or been dragged down the embankment. But there were no tire tracks, no witnesses, no clear motive. As the investigation deepened, suspicion turned to those within her circle. The ex-boyfriend was questioned again. Co-workers were re-interviewed, but each lead fizzled into nothing. Meanwhile, Dayton grieved. Every night for weeks, the windows of homes glowed with candlelight. The front steps of Maplewood Elementary became a makeshift memorial, flowers, notes from children written in crayon, and hand-painted rocks bearing her initials. Reporters described the town's silence as palpable. Parents escorted their kids everywhere, afraid to let them walk alone. The sense of safety that once defined Dayton had evaporated overnight. In one interview, a tearful colleague said, "If this could happen to Laura, it could happen to any of us." Detectives swore justice would come, but behind closed doors they knew the case was unraveling. There was no suspect, no confession, and no clear path forward. And as the river carried away the last traces of evidence, one haunting truth settled over the town. Someone out there had murdered Laura Whitmore, and that person was still free. Who could have wanted to harm a woman with no enemies? With Laura Whitmore's death now confirmed, the focus of the investigation shifted from grief to pursuit. Dayton police formed a dedicated task force, 6 detectives and 2 analysts, determined to uncover who could have taken the life of a woman universally described as kind, reliable, and without enemies. But as the weeks passed, the line between truth and rumor began to blur. Investigators first looked inward, toward the people Laura knew best. Her ex-boyfriend, Mark Ellis, a fellow teacher at Maplewood Elementary, quickly became the prime focus. The two had dated briefly the year before, ending amicably, or so it seemed. Mark cooperated fully, submitting to hours of interviews and even a polygraph test. But when inconsistencies surfaced about his whereabouts the night of the disappearance, whispers began circulating through town. Mark claimed he had been home grading papers until midnight. Yet neighbors remembered hearing his car start around 9 p.m., roughly the same time Laura was last seen. Police brought him in again for questioning, but without physical evidence, the case against him remained circumstantial. The polygraph was inconclusive. "It's not proof," Detective McKinney told reporters. "But we're not ruling anything out." Attention soon turned to another familiar face, a school maintenance worker named Jerry Long, who had once made Laura uncomfortable by lingering too long in her classroom after hours. A few co-workers recalled Laura mentioning it, though she never filed a complaint. When detectives questioned Long, he seemed nervous, defensive. He admitted to having admired her but denied any involvement in her disappearance. His alibi, playing cards with friends at a bar across town, checked out, and his fingerprints didn't match the ones from Laura's car. Still, suspicion spread through the community like wildfire. Each day brought new rumors. A drifter seen near the river, a mysterious caller to the police claiming to have information, a dark sedan reported following women near Maplewood Elementary. None of it panned out. Each lead ended the same way, empty. Behind the scenes, tension simmered within the department. Detectives disagreed about priorities. Some believed the initial crime scene had been mishandled, the car left exposed to weather for too long, potential evidence contaminated. Others argued they were wasting time chasing dead ends instead of focusing on forensics. Memos later obtained by journalists revealed a deep divide between the lead investigator and his superiors, one that would haunt the case for years. Meanwhile, The Whitmore family endured constant speculation. Reporters camped outside their home. Anonymous letters arrived claiming to know what happened. One even accused her father of covering up details, an accusation both cruel and baseless. Her parents withdrew from public view, clinging only to each other and the few detectives who still promised answers. By late summer, the investigation had ballooned into a mountain of paperwork, interview transcripts, evidence logs, and reports filled with more questions than conclusions. Detectives revisited Laura's last day dozens of times, mapping her route minute by minute. But every version ended the same way, a blank space between her cheerful phone call and the moment her car was found. In September 1995, the task force met to review progress. The lead detective's voice was weary as he spoke. "We have suspects. We have theories. But what we don't have," he paused, "is proof." By autumn, Laura's case file was 3 inches thick and still offered no clear path forward. One detective described it as a jigsaw puzzle with half the pieces missing. The community's patience was fading, the media had moved on, and within the station, morale was crumbling. The case that once galvanized Dayton was slowly collapsing under the weight of uncertainty. Would Dayton ever know who killed their beloved teacher? Or was justice already slipping away? After months of leads that went nowhere, the case of Laura Whitmore slipped quietly into the archives of the Dayton Police Department. By 1996, the task force had been disbanded, the press had moved on, and life in the small Ohio community tried to resume its rhythm. But for Laura's family, there was no such thing as moving on, only surviving. Her parents, Helen and Robert Whitmore, became fixtures in the waiting rooms of police headquarters. They called detectives weekly, then monthly, and finally, when there was nothing new to say, they stopped calling at all. Birthdays came and went. Each December, Helen still wrapped a small gift for her daughter, a scarf, a book, a necklace, then placed it in the cedar chest beside Laura's childhood bed. The silence of their home was unbearable. For the community, Laura's memory lingered like an echo. The elementary school where she had taught created the Laura Whitmore Memorial Scholarship, awarded each spring to a student who showed kindness and leadership, traits she'd embodied effortlessly. In the school courtyard, a mural of bright sunflowers bloomed across the brick wall, painted by students who had once sat in her classroom. Underneath, a simple line read, "She made the world brighter." Yet behind these tributes, frustration festered. Every few years, a new detective would take a look at the case, flipping through yellowed pages of reports, scanning black and white crime scene photos. They always ended up at the same impasse. No new evidence, no suspects with motive or means. A generation of investigators grew up knowing Laura's name not from memory, but from cold case briefings. By the early 2000s, several of the original detectives had retired or transferred. The old police station's evidence room, humid, crowded, and poorly cataloged, held dozens of unsolved cases, Laura's among them. Her box was labeled simply, Whitmore, LK, 1995. Inside were fibers, photographs, audio tapes of interviews, and a small envelope of biological material, sealed in evidence tape that had faded to brown. Technology was changing, but back then those samples couldn't speak. DNA profiling was still in its infancy. The state's databases were incomplete, fragmented. One detective later admitted that at the time they didn't fully understand what to preserve or how valuable it might one day become. "We boxed what we had and prayed the science would catch up," he said. As the 2000s turned to 2010, hope had thinned to a whisper. Helen and Robert grew older, frailer, their hair white, their voices soft. They attended every annual candlelight vigil at the Stillwater River Bridge, where volunteers gathered with photos of missing and murdered loved ones. Each year, fewer people came, but the Whitmores never missed one. They still believed somehow that someone somewhere knew what happened to their daughter. Meanwhile, in laboratories across the country, quiet revolutions were taking place. New methods for touch DNA, forensic genealogy, and digital record matching were transforming the way investigators approached cold cases. Decades-old evidence could now yield profiles once thought impossible. The breakthroughs were slow at first. A single suspect identified here, a confession there, but they began to ripple across the nation. By 2015, Ohio had established a statewide cold case unit with access to modern databases. For the first time, Old evidence from the 1990s could be re-examined using cutting-edge tools. Thousands of families waited for the call that could change everything. The Whitmores had nearly given up when one arrived in the spring of 2019. A detective from the newly formed unit wanted to review Laura's case. In a quiet kitchen that had not changed since the day she vanished, Helen wept when she heard those words. "We've been waiting 24 years, she said. "If there's anything left to find, please find it." Would the science of tomorrow finally reveal the secrets buried in 1995? In early 2023, Detective Erin Cole, barely 30 and known for her relentless attention to detail, joined the Montgomery County Cold Case Initiative. Fresh from the state crime lab, she had grown up hearing about breakthroughs in forensic genealogy, cases once unsolvable, now cracked wide open by a single microscopic trace. When she saw the Whitmore file on the review list, something about the image of the smiling teacher pinned to the case summary drew her in. Laura's case had haunted Dayton for nearly 3 decades, but to Erin it wasn't just another cold file. It was unfinished business for an entire community. She spent nights poring over every page, transcribing old interview notes and highlighting inconsistencies that had long been overlooked. Among the evidence logs, one entry caught her attention. Fingernail scrapings, trace material, untested. In 1995, that note would have meant little. DNA technology was too primitive, too expensive, and often too degraded to analyze. But now with next-generation sequencing, even a single skin cell could tell a story. Erin filed a request to reprocess the samples at the state lab in Columbus, knowing that contamination or degradation could still ruin everything. The lab technicians cautioned her. It was a long shot. But she'd learned that long shots were often how justice began. As weeks passed, Erin kept the case close, reviewing old photographs of Laura's car, reading witness transcripts and mapping timelines. She found something chilling buried in the original notes, records of late-night phone calls Laura had reported before she disappeared, numbers traced to unlisted payphones around Dayton. None had led anywhere. Back then, no caller ID, no digital trail. But today, even that might be traceable through archived telecom records. Erin made a note to revisit that later. Then, in mid-April, an email arrived. The subject line read, "DNA partial match notification." Erin froze. Inside, the report detailed a partial familial DNA match from the reprocessed fingernail scrapings, an unknown male relative, identified through a public genealogy database used by law enforcement. It wasn't a direct suspect, but it was the first real lead in 28 years. The match led to a Midwestern family tree, one branch traced to a small town just outside Dayton. Erin and the lab's genealogist began constructing the lineage backward, generation by generation. The web narrowed. Brothers, cousins, nephews. One name in particular began to surface repeatedly across public records. Someone who had lived in Dayton during the 1990s, working maintenance jobs across various schools, including the one where Laura had taught. Erin's pulse quickened. Could this connection be real or just coincidence? She pulled archived employment rosters from the school district's storage unit. There it was. Richard "Rick" Lawson, maintenance contractor, employed from 1993 to 1996. A man in his mid-20s, at the time quiet, unremarkable, with no criminal record. But records also showed he had abruptly left his job weeks after Laura's disappearance. Further digging revealed something even stranger. Lawson's nephew, still living in Ohio, had voluntarily submitted DNA to an ancestry database the year prior. That was the match. Erin now had a familial link between Laura's killer and a living relative. The implications were staggering. After 3 decades of silence, the evidence under Laura's fingernails was finally speaking. The department reactivated the case officially. A new round of subpoenas went out. Old witnesses were recontacted, and for the first time in years, Helen Whitmore received a call that didn't end in disappointment. Detective Cole spoke softly. "Mrs. Whitmore, we found something. We're not done yet, not by a long shot." As the sun set that evening, Erin stood outside the Dayton precinct, holding the faded case photo of Laura Whitmore. "You fought back," she whispered. "And now your voice is finally being heard. Who did that trace belong to, and how close were they to Laura all along?" The genetic trail that began with a fragment of DNA beneath Laura Whitmore's fingernails had taken detectives on a months-long journey through family trees, marriage records, and decades-old addresses. Bit by bit, the web narrowed until only one name remained at its center: Thomas Reardon. Reardon had once lived on the same street as Laura, just 4 houses down, during the early 1990s. Back then, he was known as the quiet, dependable handyman, the kind of man who fixed fences and mowed lawns for elderly neighbors. He kept mostly to himself, occasionally helping with small maintenance jobs around the local elementary school, the very same one where Laura taught 2nd grade. Detective Erin Cole studied his old address on the yellowing property record. Her heart pounded as she realized how close he had always been. Reardon had vanished from Dayton shortly after Laura's murder, relocating to Indiana, then eventually to Kentucky, where he'd lived for the past 20 years under a modest, unremarkable life. Married once, divorced quietly, no criminal record, no red flags. When investigators finally tracked him down, Reardon was 63 years old, thin, gray-haired, and living alone in a rented trailer outside Louisville. His voice was polite when detectives arrived. He seemed confused, even slightly amused when they asked about his time in Dayton. "That was a long time ago," he said. "Don't remember much." Cole pressed gently. "Did he remember Laura Whitmore?" "Can't say I do," Reardon replied, his eyes flickering for the briefest second. He claimed he had never met her, never worked at the school. But the record said otherwise. Payroll receipts placed him on the property several times in early 1995. Still, without physical proof, denial meant little, and Erin needed something indisputable. So they watched him, quietly, patiently. Investigators followed him to grocery stores, to a hardware shop, to his morning coffee runs. One crisp autumn morning, Reardon tossed an empty coffee cup into a public trash bin outside a diner. A technician in plain clothes retrieved it moments later. Within 48 hours, the lab results came back, a direct match to the DNA extracted from Laura Whitmore's fingernails in 1995. After nearly 30 years of silence, the truth had a name. Dayton awoke the next morning to flashing headlines. Ohio, 1995. Cold case solved. Arrest shocks community. The news rippled through the city. For those who remembered Laura, time seemed to rewind, back to candlelight vigils, to the faces of children holding photos of their teacher, to the day hope had first died. Now justice, long frozen, was stirring again. Detective Cole and 2 local deputies drove to Kentucky to make the arrest. When they arrived, Reardon was sitting on his porch, watching the morning fog lift from the trees. "Mr. Reardon," Erin said quietly, "you're under arrest for the murder of Laura Whitmore." He didn't resist, didn't even ask why. In the interrogation room later, he spoke little. "I didn't mean for it to happen," he muttered once, staring at his hands. But when asked what he meant, he fell silent again. As word spread, Dayton was gripped by disbelief. How could the man who once fixed neighbors' porches and waved from his pickup truck have harbored such darkness? Why Laura? A kind teacher with no enemies. Reporters camped outside the courthouse. Former students, now adults, gathered at the memorial near her old classroom, leaving flowers. And as Thomas Reardon's name echoed across evening broadcasts, a deeper question settled over the town, one that no lab report could answer. What drove a quiet handyman to murder a beloved teacher? And could justice still be served after 3 decades? The courtroom was silent except for the low hum of cameras outside and the soft shuffle of reporters finding their seats. It had been 29 years, 7 months, and 14 days since Laura Whitmore vanished, and now her family was finally face to face with the man accused of taking her life. Thomas Reardon, gaunt and gray, sat at the defense table, eyes fixed on the floor. The air felt heavy, thick with the weight of decades. Across the aisle sat Helen and Robert Whitmore, now in their late 70s, hands clasped tightly together. They had waited half their lives for this moment, a moment they feared might never come. The prosecution began with the simplest fact: DNA doesn't lie. A strand of genetic evidence preserved beneath Laura's fingernails in 1995 had survived humidity, storage, and time itself. The jury listened as expert witnesses described the genealogical tracing, the familial match in the discarded coffee cup that tied Reardon directly to the crime. The odds of coincidence, they said, were 1 in a billion. Then came the story the prosecutors built, a portrait of obsession. In the spring of 1995, Reardon, who had occasionally worked maintenance jobs near Laura's home and school, became fixated on her. Former co-workers recalled overhearing remarks that seemed harmless at the time. "She's too good for this town," or "I see her driving home most nights." No one thought much of it then, but pieced together decades later, it revealed a man quietly consumed. Witnesses recounted seeing Reardon's truck parked near the old railroad bridge weeks before the murder. A neighbor remembered a single knock on Laura's door late one night, a man's voice saying he'd come to check the porch light. Laura had mentioned it to a friend but brushed it off. The defense argued circumstantial evidence, claimed the DNA transfer could have been incidental, that Reardon might have fixed something in her classroom years before. But the jury saw through it. The most haunting moment came when the crime scene photos were shown, images most in the room had never seen. The faded Polaroids of Laura's abandoned car by the bridge, the half-lit road swallowed in fog. Prosecutors described how she fought back, how her fingernails told the final chapter of her story, how she refused to go quietly. When the verdict came, the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. The foreperson stood, hands trembling slightly. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Thomas Reardon, guilty of the murder of Laura Whitmore." Helen let out a quiet sob, clutching Robert's hand. Around them, the room fell into solemn silence. Then a slow ripple of applause began, hesitant at first, but growing as it spread through the crowd. For a brief moment, after 3 decades of grief and waiting, there was release outside. The courthouse steps filled with reporters broadcasting breaking news. Ohio 1995, cold case solved. Guilty verdict brings justice after 30 years. But for the Whitmore family, justice was a bittersweet gift. "We're grateful," Helen told one journalist through tears. "But nothing gives us back the years we lost." That night, the old bridge near Stillwater River glowed softly with candlelight. Dozens gathered, former students, friends, and strangers, whispering prayers into the cool autumn air. The mural at Laura's old school was repainted the next morning, her smiling face now surrounded by the words, "Justice never forgets." What legacy would Laura's story leave behind for her community and for cold case investigators everywhere? When the verdict came down in the spring of 2024, it did more than convict a killer. It reignited something in Ohio that had dimmed for far too long. The resolution of Laura Whitmore's cold case became a living testament to the power of persistence, community, and faith in the slow grind of justice. Within weeks of the trial, the Dayton Police Department formally established a cold case division, its first dedicated unit of investigators trained in modern DNA and genealogy techniques. The initiative was named after Laura, the Whitmore Cold Case Program, honoring the teacher whose tragedy had sparked institutional change. Her story was now being used in state seminars, showing how evidence thought obsolete could still speak. Decades later, Detective Erin Cole, who had led the breakthrough, became the program's first coordinator. In an interview, she reflected softly, "Laura reminded us that no file is ever truly closed. Sometimes you just have to wait for the science and the right eyes and to catch up." Across Dayton, the community that had once mourned in silence began to heal. Former students, now in their 30s and 40s, gathered at the elementary school auditorium for a memorial service. Some brought their own children, introducing them to the teacher they'd loved, the woman who taught them to read, to believe in kindness, to never give up on themselves. One former student, now a teacher herself, stood at the podium and said, "When I help a child learn, I feel like Mrs. Whitmore is still here, guiding me the way she always did." Outside the school, the new mural unveiled that morning glowed beneath soft spring sunlight. It showed Laura surrounded by books and children, Her smile gentle, her eyes bright. Below it, the inscription read, "Her light still guides us." For the Whitmore family, those 5 words carried more comfort than any verdict ever could. Laura's parents, though frail, attended the unveiling. Helen spoke briefly to the crowd. "For 30 years, we lit candles for Laura so the world wouldn't forget her. Today, we can finally set those candles down. Her light doesn't need our help anymore, it shines on its own." Tears rolled freely as the crowd stood in silent respect. The moment both heartbreaking and healing. News of the case's closure spread beyond Dayton, reaching across Ohio and into national headlines. Other departments began dusting off long-forgotten files. In Columbus, Cleveland, and Toledo, detectives reopened cases they once thought hopeless. Inspired by how one teacher's story had reignited belief in the impossible, documentaries and podcasts soon followed, each retelling Laura's story not as one of tragedy alone, but of endurance, of a justice system learning to listen to the faintest whisper of truth, even when decades had passed. For Erin Cole, closing the case was not an ending but a beginning. "This isn't about one arrest," she said in a televised interview. "It's about a promise that every family waiting in silence deserves to be heard." As dusk fell over Dayton one evening, candles once again flickered by the Stillwater River. Not in mourning, but in remembrance. The same bridge that once symbolized loss now stood as a marker of perseverance. Children placed flowers in the water, watching them drift toward the horizon. Nearly 30 years after her light was stolen, Laura Whitmore's legacy had become something unbreakable, a flame passed from hand to hand, refusing to fade. What does justice truly mean when time steals so much? 30 years after Laura Whitmore's disappearance, the state of Ohio finally witnessed justice long overdue. What began as a tragic mystery in 1995 ended as a story of perseverance, innovation, and the quiet power of those who never stopped believing. Her name, once whispered in grief, is now spoken with reverence, a symbol of how truth can still rise, even from the deepest silence. When Thomas Reardon was convicted, it wasn't triumph that filled the courtroom, and it was relief. For Laura's aging parents, for the former students who never forgot her kindness, for the detectives who inherited a case older than themselves, this was closure, fragile but real. The verdict didn't erase 30 years of pain, but it restored something far more important: faith that justice, however slow, still moves forward. Across Ohio, law enforcement agencies began reassessing long-dormant cases. The success of Laura's case breathed new life into forgotten files, proving that modern DNA technology could rewrite history. Her story became a case study in persistence, showing that justice doesn't depend solely on time, but on will. Yet beyond the courtroom, Laura's true legacy lives in the lives she touched. Her former students carry her lessons into classrooms of their own. Her family continues to support cold case advocacy groups, ensuring no voice fades unheard. And at the school where she once taught, her mural stands bright, a teacher forever watching over her community. In the end, the Whitmore case reminds us that justice delayed is not always justice denied. Sometimes, it's simply waiting for the right moment, the right hands, and the right heart to finish what time began. May Laura's story inspire us all to remember, to seek truth, and to never stop fighting for those still waiting in the dark.